Now back to our top story and the details of systematic torture in Syria. Let's get the opinion of Ammar Waqqaf from the Syrian Social Club. That's a group of Syrians based in the UK. Thank you very much for speaking to us. So your reaction to these crimes documented by Human Rights Watch. It's of course not the first time that there have been reports of abuse and torture by Syrian forces. But did you think it was on this scale?
Well, I could only dream of a day when such practices are a thing of the past, not only in Syria, but in the entire Middle East region, because these things are pretty much common. Obviously, the urgency of the situation in Syria is much more than in places like Jordan or Saudi Arabia. Now, I have to say, though, that such practices are done more in line with the extraordinary rendition practice rather than the Abu Ghraib practice, i.e. the people who are carrying out these things are not doing it to have some fun overnight, but actually to extract certain information that they deem vital to their work. And I do condemn it.
But on this scale, really, I mean, the report found that tens of thousands of people, and not just men, but children as well, had been detained by the Department of Military Intelligence. Certainly it doesn't excuse this, does it?
There is no excuse really for such practices, but the way I look into things is that how the international community should intervene in this is that to engage with the Syrian government to train their interrogation people in order to behave a little bit more humanely, in a sense. You cannot condone such practices, obviously. However, with regards to the conduct of the Human Rights Watch themselves, one could only question why, for example, they're not talking at all about civilians being targeted, humiliated and abused by the armed groups that are operating under the
They
banner
have in
of
the
the
past. Human Rights Watch and other groups have in fact said that some members of the Free Syria Army have also been involved in torture and abuse. So I don't think it's just a one-sided thing.
Not quite, because the way they put it actually is that they say, well, the Free Syrian Army or the armed groups are torturing collaborators with the government or Syrian soldiers and Shabiha or whatever, but nobody talks about the civilians that are being killed, and there are dozens really by those people, and that is yet to come out in a formal report. I understand that Amnesty International are working on something of the sort at the moment, and I can only wait for their report to come up. However, I also question why put the coordinates of the Syrian intelligence buildings in a formal report. The last time we've had such a building had a coordinate that is acknowledged by the entire population or the entire world. We had a suicide bomber by Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda affiliated group, killing dozens of civilians, tens of cars, dozens of civilians killed, hundreds of people killed, you know, Damascus University buildings, you know, completely shattered, and so on. I don't see the reason why they had to put the coordinates of those buildings, really.
I guess this would be sort of seen as evidence for them to basically justify, to show that this is actually happening. This is them providing evidence, perhaps.
Let's just hope that won't be counterproductive and no other people are getting killed because of this.
Let's move on, if we can, Ammar Waqqaf, because I want to get your thoughts on a few other points. We saw this interview of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in a Turkish newspaper today, in which he talked about relations with Turkey, of course, trying to calm the tensions with Turkey. But in this interview, President Assad also said that Syrian people could choose to dismiss him, but only through elections. What do you make of this? I mean, can elections be held in Syria today?
Well, not today, obviously.
So this
Syria
means that he's not going anywhere just yet?
Is in a state of war. No. I mean, he finishes his current tenure in office in 2 years, and you know, at the time there will be elections. Now, if the international community or half of the international community, the regional players and so on, take their foot off the gas in a sense and let Syria live a normal life, then probably normal elections would take place. But everything now is playing into his own hands. He's now becoming a person who has stood up for half of the planet, in a sense. This guy is preventing Syria from disintegrating into a civil war, into multi-states and so on.
Well, he seems to be increasingly alone, it would seem, because we're seeing a shift even in China and Russia's position. Russia, which is as a close ally of Damascus. I mean, this can't be underestimated, surely. The Russians now seem to be on board with this plan for an interim government in Syria. So Bashar al-Assad seems increasingly isolated. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I don't agree at all. Actually, I think the Russians and the Chinese have their own stakes into this. I don't think they care much who's governing Syria, but they, I think, view Syria as a situation where they can increase their geopolitical influence over the world and have more say in international politics. They obviously regret letting the West have their way in Libya, and they think that was a huge debacle. So they're probably digging their heels on the Syria matter. Obviously, Russia as well have the own issue of Chechnya and probably wouldn't favor an Islamic affiliated government in Damascus. But you know, an interim government, is that something that the Syrians would want at the moment? It is hard to envisage, actually, you know, speaking politically, it's hard to envisage how anyone can actually exert any influence of the Syrian government to accommodate people who do not have any influence on the ground, really. The opposition figures that we see, for example, outside Syria, who are, for example, meeting in Cairo these days, they do not exert much pressure on the ground, influence on the ground. They cannot stop the armed groups from killing people, for example. They cannot do anything. So why include them in the government? What signal that might give? Anyway,
the armed groups have also expressed that they said they're not interested in the meantime of joining an interim government. Thank you very much. It's good to talk to you again. Ammar Waqqaf of the Syrian Social Club joining us there from London. Thanks for your time.